So, hi, welcome everyone to the second night of Vancouver Women's Health Collective Intersectional Crisis Intervention Training. My name is AJ. Tonight we're doing our workshop on Introduction to Systems of Power and Control. And before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge that this project was researched, written, and hosted on the unceded ancestral territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and also the Stalo nations. And it's really important to do this land acknowledgement because it's a protocol that's been practiced on this land for time immemorial, continues to be practiced. And for many of us who don't originate in these lands, who come as settlers, diasporic settlers, that it's important that we actually orient ourselves and reflect on our relationship to this land as we engage, particularly in this work. A lot of the topics that we're covering tonight and over the course of the week navigate systems that impact all of us, and in particular impact community members, Indigenous community members that are ancestral to these lands and who continue to experience harm, oppression, and violence directly through these topics that we're engaging with. So just recognizing and naming there's an ongoing relationship and that there's incredible movement within the downtown east side that is led by Indigenous organizations working on cultural reclamation, sovereignty, and healing within the community. So it's just really important to acknowledge that and hold that to be true as we navigate the work that we're going to navigate. We're going to do a little opening round. And I invite you to share your name, your pronouns, what territory you are situated on, perhaps your ancestry, how you came to be in this place. If you have any access needs tonight, if you're joining us as part of an organization, which organization you're coming from, and if there was a color that described how you're feeling tonight, what color would that be? And I just asked Amanda to include in the chat a link to nativeland.ca and Squamish Atlas. So if you're curious about learning more about how to situate yourself, whose territory you're living on, Native Land is an amazing resource to learn not only about this territory, but also across Turtle Island. And Squamish Atlas in particular is run by the Squamish Nation and actually names landmarks and settlement sites in the Squamish language. So that's really an amazing point to also situate ourselves in Vancouver, and there are names that are connected to this land that were here long before settlement and long before the settler colonial names that we use today. So if you're curious, those are some great resources. So tonight we've got our agenda. We're going to do some ground rules and guidelines, setting some goals. Some of this will be familiar for you folks who were here last night. And then we're going to jump into identifying systems of oppression, the 3 I's of oppression, practicing and identifying what we've learned about, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. And much like last night, I encourage you to actively engage as much as you can with the materials present. So if you have a pen and paper handy to take notes, or you want to take notes on your device, whatever is a way that will help you better integrate the materials you're going to learn, I encourage you to get that ready now. So I've got a list here of the ground rules that were developed at the Vancouver Women's Health Collective with the volunteers. And these are some of the values. So as a part of ensuring that this content is also accessible, I'm going to read a lot of what is what you can see on the screen, so that if folks are engaging at a later time with recordings of this learning, that they can also still engage with it without relying on the visuals. So on the ground rules slide, we've got listed respect, listening to understand, as opposed to listening from a reactive place or from a defensive place, really being orienting around curiosity and wanting to understand the content and the different perspectives that are going to be shared tonight. In that vein, cultivating an openness to understand different ideas or different lived experiences, recognizing that we all truly come with so much embodied knowledge and experience and ways of knowing and being, and really recognizing and valuing all the different perspectives that are coming in, that are being shared. A willingness to engage in challenging conversations. A lot of the work that not only we're doing tonight, but over the course of this week and in future trainings, requires a willingness to kind of be humble and to be curious about what you know, what you thought you knew, and maybe what you need to unlearn. So we're all coming together in this invitation of curiosity and willingness to keep learning new things and maybe be surprised by what we're going to learn as well. An invitation, small group, so hopefully no one will be too impatient that we jump over each other, but we are currently in a virtual space, so that can just make some things feel a little bit stilted. So having some patience and understanding that everybody's navigating technology to the best of their ability. Using I instead of we statements. It's really important, especially when we're dealing with work and content that can be quite activating, that can feel quite heavy or really affect and land in people's bodies in different ways. Utilizing I statements really centers around your experience, your perspectives, and prevents generalization and ideally prevents harm being enacted. Even if it's unintentional, focusing on I allows for specificity and curiosity for other folks to come through. Being conscious of how much or how little space you take up is really valuable insight and awareness to carry into any space that you're occupying, particularly for cis white folks. There's a tendency to, feel safe and centered in spaces, and we just invite some awareness and curiosity about, how often you are sharing. And again, Zoom can be weird in this realm, but giving everyone, there is room for silence here. We can sit and be with each other as folks are thinking and navigating. So just holding that awareness. Which is kind of what the next question talks about. We invite you to consider, is yours the voice that is missing from the conversation, or would someone else's voice be better centered? A great question to carry forward on the day-to-day, not just in these workshops. And we invite you to challenge ideas, not people. So rather than making the work personal, a lot of what we're sharing impacts everyone in different ways. We can focus on the challenges of what is being presented and challenging the content that is being shared, asking questions about that. And again, operating from that I place as opposed to we, and preventing assumptions from being made or potentially like imposing assumptions on other people. We invite you to understand the difference between feeling uncomfortable and feeling unsafe. Discomfort is really important for growth. I always think of the image of growing pains. Sometimes growing doesn't feel good. It feels really uncomfortable. And there's a difference between feeling uncomfortable and actually feeling attacked or potentially harmed or violated. So, sitting with your body, I'll invite you to do lots of different check-ins as we're going through the workshop, but to just notice, if there's discomfort coming up, listening to your body, you know it best, you know yourself best, how to support yourself, and just noticing what the difference is. If you do feel unsafe, please direct message Amanda, and we'll do our best to support you in the moment. And of course, at the bottom of the ground rules, we invite self-reflection, thinking critically, and compassion, sensitivity to others. We're all coming in with so much wisdom and knowledge in our bodies from our experiences, and we invite awareness, self-reflection, and some critical thinking about how the information we're going to share tonight actually resonates with you and the communities around you. So there's also a lot of ground rules, a lot to integrate at once. And, hopefully, many of you heard these rules last night, and hopefully also you can start to consider how they will show up, not just in these learning spaces, but also elsewhere in your life. These are tools that are really valuable as we move through different learning spaces and community spaces, particularly when we're working with marginalized communities. These can really be a grounding to engage in service-oriented work. We're going to do some goal setting. Goals, what the heck are they? They generally are considered an objective or a target that someone is trying to achieve. And the purpose of setting goals is really to help us stay focused, to help track the progress we're making, and to keep us motivated to continue to engage with whatever we're working towards. So whether that's a physical activity, some kind of sport, or learning something new, or unlearning some of the systemic issues that we'll be discussing tonight, measuring and tracking goals can be really useful to support that growth and that evolution. And the reality is some of the content that we're going to share, not only tonight and other nights, it can be complex, it can be a little bit hard to relate with. So setting goals can actually help clarify how you want to learn from the material and continue to invoke curiosity when there is a lot of new things being brought to the table, or maybe some old things that you're already aware of, but you're needing to reapproach or reframe. Ultimately, this workshop and setting goals is here to support you on whatever journey you're on working with Vancouver Women's Health Collective or other organizations to work toward providing more confident, trauma-informed, and decolonized conflict de-escalation and service and services. So let's take a moment and brainstorm some goals. So I just invite you to consider some of these questions while you're writing your goals at home. What do you hope to achieve from the session? And what are you hoping to take away from the session? Maybe we're talking about systems of oppression. So what do you know or what don't you know? Sometimes it's really helpful to start by orienting around where there's information missing, where maybe it's something that you've heard about but have never really delved into before. So we'll just take a few moments to give you an opportunity to reflect on that and to consider maybe some goals. Or sometimes I find goals aren't always the most helpful for me to track my progress, so I like to ask myself questions. So maybe there's a question you have for yourself about systems of oppression, and if you write it down now, you note it in the back of your mind, you can reflect it at the end of the workshop and see if, in fact, the question got answered or if it led to more questions. Okay, it looks like folks have finished writing. So, there we go. The Vancouver Women's Health Collective has drafted some goals, not only for this workshop series, but also for the organization itself. So in order to maybe complement or contrast the goals or the questions you've created for yourself, we've elected to share these. So I'm going to read from the slide. The first bullet is, we at the Vancouver Women's Health Collective are learning how to be an anti-oppressive, intersectional, trauma-informed service provider. A lot of big words in that first goal. And so we'll just tackle them a little bit so we really understand what the intent is. So anti-oppressive, recognizing that there are systems of oppression that we're going to get to and talk about that affect different marginalized groups, and how we're working to provide services in a way that actually does not proliferate and continue to support those systems of oppression. Intersectional, hot topic word right now, recognizing that folks are coming in and accessing these services who experience and move through the world operating different intersections, whether that's race, class, gender, or even status on this land. Trauma-informed is a really big one. And again, trauma is a word that's really being used a lot right now. It's being thrown around. But in this case, we're talking about the results of systems of oppression within bodies, within folks who are accessing the services. So recognizing that we need to be trauma-informed to understand how folks are coming in, why they're behaving or responding or needing access to services the way they are, and actually ensuring that we provide services that is informed by that information, informed by that context. So the next point we have here is Vancouver Women Health Collective strives to help better your understanding of oppression and discrimination and how they affect the lives and experiences of marginalized folks and marginalized communities. We strive to better your understanding of how anti-oppression connects to our roles in community service. So whether that's in the downtown east side, I believe, Noam, you shared that you're in Squamish. Again, how having an anti-oppression lens really impacts all of the communities that we're operating within and the services that we're providing. We strive to develop better practices for crisis intervention. Practices designed to prevent you from resorting to calling the police or restricting access to services. So a word that can kind of encapsulate this objective is anti-carceral or anti-penal. So we're working to move away from orienting around punishing someone, removing them from a situation and isolating them. We're actually working on community care processes. And in fact, this workshop is community care. We're showing up together, sharing what we know, utilizing new tools to be able to support the marginalized communities that we are engaging with. And finally, we work with clients to reduce or eliminate barriers and reduce behaviors that are counterproductive or harmful. So that really ties into the trauma-informed approach, recognizing that these systems of oppression really show up in different bodies in different ways. And we'll get to talking about the different levels of oppression and how that can actually show up in someone's body, recognizing that that will show up in different behaviors. And we really want to be informed on how to support folks in the best way possible. They know their bodies just in the same way that we know our own bodies. So how can we support folks to reduce behaviors that will be harmful and provide access to services that maybe they don't necessarily get as much access to? Okay, a lot of goals, a lot of grounding. Let's just take a moment to take a breath, to be present with our body. You know, we've set some goals for ourselves and we're here, it's dark, the sun has set, and we're gonna engage in some challenging topics. So really just invite you to be present and, you know, listen to your body. I'm gonna move my shoulders a bit. I'm standing and just take a nice deep breath. Okay, so introduction to systems of power and control. So we're going to be offering you some high-level definitions of systems of oppression, which are also known as systems of power and control. We're going to offer you a brief overview of what these systems are and which systems of power, control, and privilege oppress and marginalize many individuals and many different communities. This is really important because you folks are the frontline workers. You're actually engaging with our communities. And it's really important as frontline workers to be able to understand these overarching systems so that you know the impact on the individuals that you're working with on a day-to-day basis. And that you're grounded in a historical context that marginalized folks, you know, may not just necessarily be experiencing on a daily basis, but they may have been experiencing intergenerationally. And doing this work, making these connections between oppressive systems and the effects on people is what actually will help you to provide support services with the trauma-informed lens. Now, again, I'm throwing the word trauma-informed around, and there will be hopefully be a workshop further down the road to really unpack the complexities around what trauma-informed services are. But even just this understanding will really help you to support the folks that are accessing these services. So I'm going to read the slide and read out our unit objectives. So we've got, the first one is learn to define and recognize systems of oppression. Second objective is understand what systems of power, I'm going to start that again. The second objective is understand which systems of power, control, and privilege oppress and marginalize many people in our communities, in different communities. The next objective is to critically think about how systems of oppression impact and influence the lives of our community members, specifically in the downtown east side, where the Vancouver Women's Health Collective operates, who the primary clients we serve are. And finally, consider how these systems affect the ways that we offer services and why it's important to offer this trauma-informed care. And as we're going through this workshop, we just invite you to really think critically and reflect on these concepts, not only in the context of the organization you're going to be working with, but also on how these concepts show up in your daily lives, show up in your daily interactions, show up in the spaces that you engage in and occupy, and also within your relationships, because we are all affected by them. Okay, so after this slide, the next slide is going to list a whole bunch of systems of oppression that contribute both individually and kind of intertwined to the impression of marginalized individuals and groups. And there's a whole heck of a lot of systems of oppression, and we're not going to touch on all of them. And the list that we're going to share is not in any way categorized by most to least harmful. These are just these have been compiled, and the purpose of sharing them is to really ensure that we're building a shared language, understanding different systems at play, and inviting you to start to think about how these start to show up in your life, in your interactions, and when you're providing services and care. Just a note that the tendency to want to compare the different systems of oppression is one that's rooted in white supremacy. Supremacy is the desire to put one body or experience above another. So we're just noting that we're not here to do that. Everyone's experience is different, and we all engage with these systems of oppression in different ways, depending on the privileges, depending on our access points. So I'm going to read from the slide here that there's an extensive list of systems of oppression that contribute collectively and in concert to the oppression of marginalized individuals and groups. Many people experience abuse and trauma from multiple oppressive systems simultaneously. And this overlapping between oppressed groups is referred to as intersectionality, which is italicized. Below that, I've included a picture of Kimberly Crenshaw, who founded the term intersectionality. And I've got a picture of her. She's got her hair up in a ponytail. She's wearing a pink shirt. And beside her is some text that reads intersectionality, understanding the social and political impacts of intersecting identities. And we're not going to touch much more on intersectionality because on Friday, there is a workshop regarding intersectionality and inequities in BC's health system. But it's an important term to consider when we're talking about systems of oppression, because folks are going to be operating at different intersections. And thus, different systems are going to affect them in different ways. They'll be embodied in different ways. Okay, here's the list. I'm going to go through it. I'm going to read them out. And I just ask, as I read out this list, check in with yourself. It can be a bit painful. You might have sensations come up listening to all of these different oppressive systems that affect different community members. So, just take care of yourself as we go through this. And by no means is this exhaustive. As I said earlier, there are more. There's always more to be added. And again, folks are operating at different intersections, are impacted by these in different ways. So first listed, we have classism, which is prejudice against or in favor of people belonging to a particular social class. Racism, prejudice discrimination or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority group or that is marginalized within the larger societal context. Sexism, prejudice, stereotyping, or discrimination, typically against women on the basis of sex. Genderism, a belief that gender is rigid, usually a belief that it is binary, comprising only of male and female, and that the aspects of a person's gender are inherently linked to their sex at birth. Capitalism, an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. So underneath capitalism, we have an added bit of information, which is two basic classes exist in capitalism: the dominant class, which controls the state and appropriates economic surplus in the form of profits and interest, and the working class. These two classes are defined by the roles they play in production, the direct result of the social division of labor. Next is heterosexism, discrimination or prejudice against gay or queer people on the assumption that heterosexuality is the normal sexual orientation. And ableism, discrimination that values and benefits able-bodied individuals over individuals with disabilities. And finally, we have ageism, prejudice or discrimination on the grounds of a person's age. That is a lot. Just invite you to take a moment, check in with your body, breathe. This list, so many of us experience different items that are listed here, and that can be challenging to hear when you experience them. And it can also be challenging to consider how many of these different items that we've listed impact the folks that we provide services for. Let's see how these different systems come together and how we actually can frame them under the 3 I's of oppression. So before we get there, let's take a moment to chat. I've got the 2 questions that are listed here on the slide. What systems of power and control do you see playing a role in your members' lives? And what are the effects of these systems of power and control on marginalized folks? So let's take a moment to think about the clients that we're providing services for, and if any of the items on that expansive list, if you can think of any of them, how they might impact some of the clients that we serve. We'll just take a moment here to give everyone a moment to think. If you want to jot down some notes. I'm going to go back so we can just see that slide. So when I think of the Women's Health Collective and my experience working as a frontline service worker, I think of the classism that is experienced within the downtown Eastside community, the amount of folks that are living in SROs, that are living on government subsistence or that don't have access to income at all. I think about sexism and the reality that so many women and gender marginalized folks are experiencing on a daily basis, and of course the necessity of the Vancouver Women's Health Collective operating, providing services. And I also think about ageism, because a lot of the folks that we're providing services for are quite young or are older, and how that living at those different polarities means that they're experiencing relating with different services that are available in a different way, and actually coming up against different barriers that I, as a 30-year-old, may not experience or understand. So I'm going to return to this slide. Oh yes, we've got a question. Yes, jump in. Thank you.
Oh, I was just thinking of an example that I can think
Mhm.
of based off of those systems of control that you mentioned.
Sure.
Something that I think has lots of layers of oppression associated with it are a lot of the bureaucratic forms or ways that people are supposed to get governmental subsidies or immigration policy approval within the Canadian system. And that has a lot of ageism, ableism, and sexism and racism involved in it as well. Not to mention all of the things with genderism. Like, I think that there's, honestly, it fits all of the list. There are so many people that have a lot of trouble understanding the jargon of those forms and not being able to understand how they can fit their lives into the boxes that have been laid out for them. Not to mention that it's all online and very convoluted. So a lot of people who are not familiar with using the internet or don't have access to digital devices have a lot of trouble being able to sort through that process on their own. And that's definitely a really big part of the type of work that's done in the House Sound Women's Center. It's something that we do maybe almost every drop-in session. So that came to mind.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, Noam. That's really useful and an excellent example of all of these systems that are actually intertwined and deeply impacting the folks that we're servicing. I've got an image here on the screen of the coin model of privilege and critical allyship. And I just thought it was useful to include an image here. So at the top and in the image, we've got in green privilege. In the middle, we've got a coin, which is yellow, and it says system of inequality, or in our case, this discussion is revolving around systems of oppression and power and control. And below the coin, we've got oppression written in red. So having this image, I think, is really helpful when we consider the different intersections that folks are operating and how these systems of power and control affect them and how each of us show up in regards to what privileges we carry forward when we're providing service and being able to recognize and consider them, and also to be able to contrast those to the reality of how many folks are navigating these different systems of oppression within marginalized communities. Privilege is another one of those hot topic words. It's often used as it can often be quite activating for folks, and I think this image does a really excellent example of demonstrating that it's really like an adjective. Um, so in the image here, we've got listed that at the top of the coin, you have advantages when others do not. You did not earn these advantages, and you have them because of who you happen to be. So privileges are things folks are born into and are not necessarily chosen. Systems of inequality, power of an oppression in the middle reflect the systemic structures that impact us, like all of the items we listed in the previous slide. And at the bottom with oppression, we've got written here that you experience disadvantages that others do not. Again, we're talking about marginalized communities. So they don't experience the same disadvantages. Communities all are experiencing different intersections. These folks did not earn these disadvantages. They were bestowed on them depending on the context that they live in, that they operate in. And they, much like privilege, they occur because that's how you are, that's how you show up in the world. So I think that's just useful to contrast and to consider when we're talking about systems of power and control, what privileges and what disadvantages are folks coming into when they're seeking services, or what are we carrying forward when we're offering services? What is oppression? What the heck? Invite you to take a moment to consider what oppression means to you. Maybe an example of how it showed up for you in your own life. Focusing again on those I statements, like what does it mean for you? And then what have you witnessed in the work that you offer and you provide? Yeah, Lannis.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the list of system of oppressions that we saw, especially ableism, because it didn't include mental illness and mental health. of unbenefited able-bodied individual over individual with disabilities, which implies that the disabilities can only be visible on the body. And I mean, personally, and in my work in the downtown east side, I think a lot of people suffer from mental illness and don't have access to the help when they need because it's invisible, right? And so it's really hard to help people sometimes because even they don't know what they suffer from. And so, yeah, I just wanted to mention that because it wasn't mentioned on the list.
Yes, thank you. That's so valuable and really important. Thank you so much for sharing that, Lannis. It is. We will add that as we improve upon our slides. We'll add that to the description of ableism, because you're right, it's really central, is that disabilities aren't visible, and it can be really tricky to provide service when you're dealing with folks who have so many intersections that they occupy and maybe themselves don't necessarily know what supports they need. So thank you so much for bringing that up. So coming back to oppression, we've got a list here that we've compiled. So oppression it can look like many different things. It can look like unequal power dynamics, privilege versus exclusion, or like we said in the last slide, disadvantage. It can look like controlling or disempowering or silencing other folks. All the things that we listed, sexism, racism, homophobia are just a few of them. Some tangible examples could be, building a wall that separates communities, pushing people down, keeping folks, again, maintaining that supremacist value of keeping some folks above and so folks disadvantaged. Closing doors, I think, is a really useful image to hold in my mind, that some folks don't even have access to doors where service is provided. And for some folks, those doors remained closed. Whereas folks who are more privileged, those doors are always open and available for them to move through. Oppression can look like making spaces feel unsafe for specific groups of people, whether that's, again, like using supremacist power dynamics or using more insidious methods, like, for example, like patronizing certain folks based on their different intersections and ways of navigating the world. For the purposes of our workshop tonight, we're going to use this definition listed on the slide here. I'll read it out. Oppression, the act of one social group using power or privilege for its own benefit, disempowering, marginalizing, silencing, and subordinating another group or groups. And next to it, there's an image of a person standing on top of some sort of, looks like a box, and they're holding something over top of the people who are below them. So they're literally maintaining power and status above those folks. So now we're going to get to the 3 I's of oppression. But before I list them, I wonder if anyone had any guesses as to what the 3 I's of oppression are. Any guesses? I had never heard this way of framing them. I found it really useful once I knew what they were, but I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the way that oppression can be embodied, that it can be relational, and that it can be structural. Any guesses as to what those 3 I words are? Yeah, go for it.
One that comes to mind is institutions. Like, I feel like a lot of the time, those are the places or the systems that oppress.
That's right. Great. That's our first one. Thank you so much, Noam. So institutional oppression.
That was so lucky.
Perfectly transitioned. We did not pay you to do that. You just knew. Thank you. Any ideas what the second one could be? Moving from a larger organizational to a system of oppression to maybe more like relational. Interpersonal. So how oppression can show up in relationship dynamics between 2 or more people. And finally, our last one. Does anyone have any guesses what the 3rd I of oppression could be? Dealing with one's own body.
Individual, just throwing it out there.
That's right. No, you're doing so great. Yes. Individualized oppression, internalized oppression. So we refer to these three words as the three I's of oppression. We know that oppression can occur organizationally, institutionally, within societies or systems that we as individuals participate in. We know that it can happen interpersonally, in relationships, when people are interacting, and we know that oppression can be internalized. So we're going to go into more detail about each of these specific forms of oppression. So the first one is institutional, as Noam shared with us. So institutional oppression is a form of oppression that is enacted and supported by society and large systems that our society controls or works within. We see institutional oppression every day in both subtle and not so subtle ways. So I include an example here. The example is a company that promotes men to higher paying positions than women. So it is illegal to pay people differently on the basis of gender, race, or sexuality. Now, that was not always the case, but currently that is the case. But the reality is companies often promote men to higher paying positions than women, even if they're less qualified than the woman. And there's a lot of statistics about there. A quick Google will share the harrowing reality of the incongruity of the pay scale. And this action or this value often stems from sexist stereotypes about an individual's capability. And it also stems from assumptions that are from a previous time period that have carried forward around women of a certain age not being reliable to the company because they will likely get pregnant and leave the company and maybe choose not to return. And although a lot has changed in our society around supporting, maternity leave and supporting folks who choose to have children coming back to work, this is still an old rooted assumption. And it reflects outdated and harmful stereotypes about not only women's, but parenting, the role of parents within society. And although companies do not explicitly say that they no longer see women as homemakers or folks who choose to birth, the actions of the mainstream institutions exemplify these assumptions. Okay, so institutional, that's one example. There's many different examples of institutional oppression. That's for a company. It can be within an organization. It can be within a group. And of course, there's a lot of institutional oppressive values that are ingrained into society that we live in, related with all of those lists of oppression that we talked about. So just ask you to take a moment to think if there are any ways that you have been affected by institutional oppression. And also you can think about the ways that you may have overlooked institutional oppression when harm was being done to others, because the reality is we all operate within these systems, within society in general as a whole. And so there are many instances when folks who experience different privileges may choose to overlook institutional oppression that harms other people, but actually still benefits us. So I think a really important acknowledgement to make around this question is in particular around decolonization and the fact that we as Canadians, as newcomers, are still benefiting from the ongoing violence and institutionalized systems of oppression that Indigenous folks are experiencing and navigating. And that we carry a lot of privilege as settlers moving about, and what a contradiction that is as we, that we have to navigate. And when we're providing these services that we need to be really aware of. Okay, so the next I is interpersonal oppression. Relational, it occurs between two or more people. often in a social setting, but it also can be, in a personal setting, in a space that is supposed to be considered safe when we think of sexualized violence, domestic violence. That's an interpersonal oppression happening between two folks in their home. So we've got an example here, Ryan and Jessica. Ryan is white, he's cis, he looks a lot like Ryan Gosling. And Jessica is a racialized woman. She's got curly hair. She kind of looks like me. So there's me and there's Ryan Gosling. So Ryan and I are dating. Oh, a thrill. And Ryan is making some racist jokes while he's with me. He's speaking over me while we're out with our friends. But he claims that he's not racist. He's not sexist. And the fact that we're dating, he's dating a woman of color, is proof of that. So this is a nice, clear, and also convoluted example of interpersonal oppression because it reflects larger systems at play. We're both participating in a society which has institutionalized forms of oppression around sexism, around racism, but it's also happening within us. So this is an example of how the three I's can truly intersect, depending on the folks who are navigating them, what they're experiencing, the context. And it's really important just to be clear that by choosing to live in the society that we live in, to engage on a daily basis as, Canadian citizens, we are complicit in the institutional oppression of different marginalized communities. And complicity is a word that, like privilege, can often be weaponized, but it's really important to depersonalize it and recognize that these are systems at play. There are always individuals that participate within these organizations, participate within our society, and that by choosing to be present, we are going to engage in our complicity in different ways, depending on the privileges that we embody, depending on the different intersections that we embody. So just noting that, noticing your own complicity within different institutional settings, within your daily life, whatever your status here on this territory is. Oh, I will just add to that, as we move into internalized oppression, in this context, it's important to consider that not only is Ryan embodying potentially some institutionalized oppression values and also interpersonal oppression, Jessica may also be experiencing some of her own internalized oppression. And we're going to get to that in the next slide. So internal oppression comes from within an individual. It starts from outside with the oppressive group, institutions, or interpersonal interactions, and it can lead to members of an oppressed or a marginalized group feeling inferior. So Jessica, in that example, may actually have her own set of internalized oppressive values. She may experience internalized racism, internalized sexism, feeling, gratitude, that she's even in a relationship, that someone loves her because she doesn't feel that she deserves it, or feeling like the comments that Ryan makes about how she presents in the world are maybe true because she doesn't feel like the way that she shows up in the world it doesn't actually match with the societal standard that's presented around her. So I've got another example here of internalized oppression. The example is a person, we'll call them Jay. Jay grows up in a community where being homosexual is not accepted. And when Jay is, ready to leave their home, they decide to move away from that community. And they believe that although, they, sorry, I'm just going to expand my notes, I can't read them. So Jane was away from their community and they claim not to be homophobic, but inside of them, they're experiencing sensations that feel restrictive around their own sexuality. maybe they have a curiosity about exploring their sexuality, but it really feels like there's this restriction that is inside of them, that within them, this judgment or this shame often. So Jay moves to the big city. They, are starting to navigate their day-to-day life, getting a job, making friends. And while they're in the city, they start to really lean heavily into gender stereotypes that align with the gender that, or the gender identities that they were taught, that they normalized. And they might present hypermasculine or hyperfeminine in order to attempt to control others' perception of them. So again, they're navigating this internal sense of responsibility to these external factors. And while they're not being told by anyone in particular, their upbringing has helped them to really internalize these feelings. They feel like they can't really talk about homosexuality. It makes them feel uncomfortable, and they don't have any queer friends. Now, Jay may not necessarily be saying explicitly that they're homophobic, but with that internalized discomfort or that potential fear or discomfort around being around queer community, they're actually embodying homophobia and that internalized homophobia. And the reality is they actually don't necessarily know. So for Jay, that homophobia didn't start within them. Jay wasn't born homophobic. None of us are born with these systems of oppression internalized within us. We learn them as kids. We're sponges. We really absorb everything around us in our environment. And we're listening to the conscious and the verbal cues. And we're also witnessing and learning from the way that folks behave, from the way that people treat each other. So those all are factors that contribute to how a person might internalize these different oppressive values. And it's important to note that once we do that self-reflection, that internal healing, that recognition of where our own assumptions, our senses of truth, of knowing what we know, as we start to reflect on that, it becomes a lot easier to recognize how we have been affected by the systems of oppression that are around us. And also it helps us to heal and be more conscious and compassionate as we are providing support for folks that are also navigating these different systems of oppression, how they're navigating these intersections. And that self-awareness is what allows us to be able to provide better support, to engage in allyship, to engage in accomplishment for the marginalized communities that we're striving to serve. Now, I just want to note that when we're talking about internalized oppression, one of the results of internalized oppression may be lateral or horizontal violence within a marginalized community. And Jay, our example for internalized oppression, is a great example of potential lateral or horizontal violence. So on the slide here, I'm just going to read it out. If people from the oppressed group feel bad about themselves and because of the nature of the system, do not have the power to direct those feelings back towards the dominant group without receiving more blows, then there are only two places to dump those feelings: on oneself and on the people in the same group. And when those negative feelings are directed at members of the same group, this is commonly referred to as lateral or horizontal violence. So when we're thinking about Jay living in the big city, navigating their internalized homophobia, if they do choose to engage in queer spaces, they may start to discover that some of those internalized values come out and engage in harmful ways in spaces that are supposed to be considered safe for queer folks. So that might look like judgment, aggression, and could potentially lead to violence within a community. And that, again, always stems from these external systems of oppression, and it's not rooted in the individual. It's a response from the individual. Okay, 3 I's: institutional, interpersonal, individual, or internal. Now we're going to practice identifying these forms of oppression. So I'm going to lay out some scenarios for you. I'll read them out, give you a moment to reflect on them. And if you have a pen and paper, you've got your technology handy, maybe make some notes about the different I's that show up for these different scenarios. Okay, so the first one is, in Vancouver, Indigenous people are often singled out by police for ID checks. So in this case, which systems of oppression are coming into play? We've got a police officer or a security guard, a person in a position of power, singling out an Indigenous person on the street looking for ID. And I'll invite you, if you have any thoughts that you'd like to vocalize about this specific example and the systems of oppression that are at play, you can type them in the chat, or you can feel free to jump in and mute yourself. Scenario 2, 6-year-old boy bring the Barbie to show and tell. The teacher tells him that boys do not play with dolls. Which of the 3 I's are coming into play? And maybe if you're remembering some of the specific isms that we talked about, one of the first slides, if any of those different systems of oppression are also coming to play as well. Nice, Lon's shared institutional oppression and institutional regarding education, as well as individual, absolutely, yeah. Now, it's just important to note that this is, of course, contextual. Currently, right now in Texas, in the States, there are many places where the education system is becoming explicitly binary in terms of gender and education. So here in Canada, the education system is not explicitly explicitly against educating around the gender binary and different forms of gender expression. So this scenario is specifically contextual because different parts of the world may be internalized, and it also may be institutional depending on the educator and the education system. Scenario 3, we're going to a broader scale here. Same-sex marriage is still illegal in many countries. So again, always thinking contextually, because the systems of oppression show up in different societies and different cultures in different ways. And we've got scenario 4. Someone leaves a comment in an online video about immigrants' rights, and the comment reads, "Go back to your own country." So I think what's really interesting about all 4 scenarios is that there are multiple systems of oppression at play. We often think of the systems of oppression as a triangle and that they're connected. And many of these scenarios fall between the different intersections. So scenario 1, we've got institutional. We know that Indigenous folks are at higher risk of being arrested or singled out by police officers. We've got incredibly high numbers of Indigenous folks in the carceral system, even though they make up such a small percentage of the population. So we've got institutionalized oppression, and we've also got internalized oppression because police officers are taught that they need to be looking out for certain at-risk groups. They're not necessarily trained specifically around all the different intersections that folks may experience because of colonization, because of mental health, because of intergenerational trauma. And we've also got interpersonal oppression because we've got someone in a position of power utilizing that power over someone who is in a marginalized group. So already in scenario 1, we've got the whole triangle is activated. Scenario 2, with the little boy bringing in a Barbie doll to school. Again, as we were saying, it can be institutional. It can also be interpersonal. Again, a person in a position of power an adult with a child. And it can be internalized. That teacher has internalized sexist values from the larger society. Scenario 3, same-sex marriage still being illegal in many countries in the world to this day. We've got institutionalized values, not only within governing bodies, but also depending on how the government relates with the current religion. We've also got colonization at play. Many countries that have been colonized are experiencing multiple levels of oppression because there is that forced understanding of morality and religious values. And we've got within that interpersonal, folks are embodying that. And we've got internal for queer folks in those communities, in those spaces. And they may be navigating their own internalization of homophobia in their bodies and in their relationships. And finally, scenario 4, someone leaving a comment in an online video about immigrants' rights. Again, the triangle is strong. We've got the institutional value hanging over that person. We have the interpersonal, this person online interacting with someone. And we've got the internal, that person has embodied those racist values, even though likely their own ancestors were immigrants. Disconnection again from their own, the way that they show up in the world and the land that they occupy. Okay, that's a lot of information. Those are some, can be often like heavy scenarios to consider. Just again, ask you to check in with your body, you know, how you're feeling. If you need to move around a little bit, take a breath, have some water, and just consider this question. How does the language, the 3 I's, help you to understand the challenges created by systems of oppression in your life and in your community? So just take a moment to reflect and to consider, because that's a big question. And with all of those different ways that it shows up, it can be personal, it can bring up sensations. So just invite you to take a moment to reflect for yourself. Okay, so one of the things that can come up when we're talking about these really big systemic issues and the multitude of them and the multiple intersections that folks can experience them is it can feel quite overwhelming and it can feel paralyzing. And it's a very natural human response to feel. And it's a lot of what we see happening in the discourse on social media when we're navigating in our own relationships. A lot of defensiveness and fear and kind of paralysis comes up. It can feel overwhelming when we're listening to the news, when we're hearing what's happening, not only around the world, but also on this land, in this country. And an important way to navigate and support those feelings is first to acknowledge them and really truly like be with your body, in the same way that we're inviting the folks that are coming in and accessing services to, you know, feel safe in their bodies in the spaces that we provide for them. And to also focus on baby steps. We can't take down these huge systems in one go. The more we educate ourselves, it can feel overwhelming as we move out of these states of kind of not knowing and being insular and encapsulated by our own privileges, our own ways of moving about the world. As we open them up, you know, we can start to feel overwhelmed, and taking action, taking small steps like being here, being a part of the different organizations that you contribute to, volunteering, learning, and truly taking care of your body, your spirit. Those are all really important and necessary small steps to take. And finally, when we're doing this kind of work, when we're providing these services, it's critical that we listen. Like we said in the ground rules, being available to listen with curiosity, recognizing that folks are coming in with different ways of navigating, different perceptions, different embodied impacts of the systems at play. And when we're providing work, one of the most important things that we do, especially as frontline service workers, is being with someone and really listening to them. Because a lot of the folks that we provide services for are deeply impacted by these massive systemic issues on a daily basis, are being told, are being unconsciously told, and are being treated in a way that demonstrates they actually don't have value. When we show up and we're present and we listen and we offer compassion to them, those are really important and critical tools to providing the services that we do. It's a lot of what our work is grounded in. This is an introductory workshop. There is so much more to learn. We really just lightly touched on these 3 I's and listed some of the many different challenges and forms of oppression that folks navigate. And I hope that, you're feeling curious and wanting to learn more about what it takes to engage with folks and provide support services. And I hope that you're not feeling too overwhelmed, because it can be really heavy. The reality of the work that we're doing, it can be challenging. And so, I hope you really just take care of yourself after this workshop. And for the folks who are elsewhere, I hope you get support with the organization that you work with, and that you also have your own, tools to support yourself as you're learning, and that you're starting to feel that curiosity, because knowledge is power. And when we learn to understand these big systemic issues, it really helps to empower us as we move about our daily lives, offer these services, but also engage in our relationships and understand how we're being impacted on a daily basis. This next slide is a great reminder for folks who occupy different intersections. Many of us who come to this work because we have experienced these different forms of oppression, because we come from these different communities, marginalized communities, and we want to provide service to our community, to our friend, our family. And the reality is, when you are a person who occupies different intersections, you come from a marginalized group, providing support and services to other people who are maybe even more deeply impacted by those systemic issues can be challenging. And at the foundation of the work we do, we ourselves as service providers need to be well in order to provide service. Lateral oppression can happen even when we're providing service if we are activated, if we are not responsible and aware for how we're showing up to the folks that we're engaging with. So it's just something important to notice, and to continue building that self-reflection and self-awareness when you're showing up to volunteer, when you're providing services, is noting what's happening in your body, building that awareness, and being able to ask for support. And when we're doing this kind of work, the priority has to be our clients, folks who are experiencing such marginalization, who are coming to us and seeking services that they can't reach and access elsewhere. And in order to do that, we have to have policy and procedure in place to support them. This policy and procedure allows us to create and cultivate safer spaces for these folks and for ourselves as service providers. And we need to establish human supports, not only for the folks we're serving, but for ourselves, because this is incredibly taxing work. We're working within an industry that is underfunded, and that can invoke feelings of scarcity or not being able to do enough. And we really need to ensure that we ourselves are supported while doing this work, so that we can lay a successful foundation for interactions within this community, within these communities, as we move forward. That was lots of information. I hope it was useful. I hope as you go away from this workshop, you can reflect on it and also do whatever you need to do to shake it off, clear your energy, take care of yourself, and come back to the work feeling fresh and revitalized tomorrow. As we move into this closing round, there's some questions here I've got listed on the slide. What are you taking away from this workshop? Did you meet that goal, or did that question get answered that you established for yourself at the beginning? Do you have more questions? Was there anything that was shared tonight that surprised you, that was unexpected? And if you'd like to share what you're curious about or what you're carrying forward, what you want to keep learning about, take a few minutes now to just have our final closing round. If anyone wants to start and share, that'd be great. And we can do it popcorn style, or you can pass it on to someone else.